England welcomed autumn with fields of amber wheat, orchards heavy with fruit, and grand estates preparing for the royal harvest ball, the most anticipated gathering in a generation. Across the kingdom, every noble household polished its silver, embroidered new gowns and rehearsed perfect introductions, because Duke Alexander Ravensheir, the 34-year-old widowed hero whose courage had preserved the crown through war and famine, had finally announced he would choose a bride. Mothers dreamed of becoming connected to the most respected duke in England. Young ladies practiced graceful smiles before polished mirrors. Noble fathers calculated fortunes, alliances, and influence. None of them understood that Alexander sought none of those things. Hidden behind the dazzling announcement lay a secret known only to the king and the duke himself. Rumors of treason had begun creeping through the highest ranks of the aristocracy like poison beneath clear water, and the king believed that someone wearing silk and jewels was preparing to betray England. Alexander had agreed to marry only because the search for a wife would reveal the true hearts of those desperate for power. Far from the cheerful excitement filling neighboring estates stood Ashcombe Manor, a magnificent house whose marble halls concealed years of quiet cruelty. Its youngest daughter, Lady Eliza Ashcombe, had never known warmth within those elegant walls. 22 years earlier, her mother had died moments after bringing her into the world, and grief had hardened her father's heart into something cold enough to mistake blame for justice. Lord Ashcombe never looked upon Eliza without seeing the wife he had buried. Her two older sisters inherited every luxury the estate could offer, while Eliza received whatever remained after everyone else had taken their share. Yet bitterness never found lasting shelter inside her. She greeted servants by name, shared meals with stable boys when no one watched, carried baskets of bread to struggling villagers, and quietly tended injured birds beneath the orchard trees. She never expected gratitude. Kindness was simply the language her heart still chose to speak despite never hearing it returned. The announcement of the Duke's ball transformed Ashcombe Manor into a hive of frantic ambition. Dressmakers hurried through endless fittings while jewelers arrived carrying velvet cases filled with diamonds and pearls. Lord Ashcombe spared no expense preparing his elder daughters, convinced one of them would become Duchess of Ravensheir. Eliza watched the excitement from the edge of every room, helping maids pin gowns, arranging flowers, and repairing torn lace with patient fingers. She was never invited to stand before the mirrors herself. Whenever visitors praised the beauty of the family, conversation carefully ignored the youngest daughter, as though pretending she no longer existed somehow made that lie become truth. One rainy afternoon an unexpected carriage arrived carrying the elderly Earl of Wexford, a man nearly 70 years old whose wealth rivaled princes despite his failing health. He requested Eliza's hand in marriage before the entire household, offering estates, gold, and political favor in exchange. Lord Ashcombe accepted before allowing his daughter to speak. The sisters laughed behind jeweled fans, congratulating themselves on finally removing the family embarrassment. Eliza listened quietly until every promise had been made without her consent. Then she lifted her eyes with remarkable calm and spoke the only answer her conscience allowed. She would not marry a man she neither respected nor loved simply because money demanded it. Her voice never rose. She offered no accusation, only dignity. The old earl departed insulted, and with him vanished the fortune Lord Ashcombe had already imagined spending. Rage swept through the manor like a storm tearing across dry fields. Her father called her selfish, ungrateful, and cursed. Her sisters declared she had thrown away the only future someone like her deserved. Even servants lowered their eyes, afraid to witness what came next. Lord Ashcombe ordered a jar of dark permanent ink brought from his study. Before anyone could object, he seized Eliza by the chin while her sisters held her still. With slow, deliberate strokes, he painted a single word across her forehead. Unwanted. The letters stretched boldly above her tear-filled eyes, impossible to hide. Silence settled through the room after the final stroke. Eliza neither screamed nor struggled. A single tear escaped down her cheek, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Weeks passed and whispers spread beyond the estate. Children pointed whenever she rode through nearby villages. Merchants stared before pretending not to notice. Even strangers believed whatever story accompanied the cruel mark because no one imagined respectable nobles capable of such humiliation. Eliza covered her forehead with ribbons or loose curls whenever possible, yet rain or wind inevitably exposed the truth again. Still, every morning she continued visiting cottages with baskets of bread, reading stories to orphan children, and comforting elderly widows abandoned by prosperous relatives. If humiliation wounded her spirit, compassion quietly stitched the torn places together each evening. When invitations to the Royal Harvest Ball finally arrived, Lord Ashcombe smiled with unsettling satisfaction. His daughters expected another round of expensive preparations, but instead he unveiled a different plan, one cruel enough to amuse the entire nobility. Eliza would attend as the family's greatest joke. Her elegant ivory gown was ripped apart before her eyes until only ragged strips remained. Fresh mud was rubbed into every fold of the ruined fabric. Her polished shoes were replaced with cracked leather boots. Fine jewelry disappeared back into velvet boxes while an old weathered suitcase filled with worthless household scraps was thrust into her trembling hands. Her sisters laughed so hard tears blurred their painted faces. Lord Ashcombe leaned close enough for only Eliza to hear. "If the kingdom remembers our family tomorrow," he whispered, "it will be because they finally saw what you truly are." Dark clouds gathered as the carriage climbed the winding road toward Ravensshire Palace. Thunder rolled across distant hills while relentless rain blurred the towering castle into a ghostly silhouette glowing beneath thousands of lanterns. One by one magnificent coaches arrived carrying dazzling noblewomen wrapped in velvet and jewels. Then Eliza's battered carriage stopped before the palace gates. She stepped into ankle-deep water clutching the old suitcase, her ruined dress soaked against her skin, the faded word upon her forehead exposed beneath dripping strands of dark hair. Laughter rippled through the waiting crowd before swelling into open mockery. Palace servants hesitated to open the doors, believing she had wandered there by mistake. Eliza stood alone beneath the relentless rain, refusing to lower her eyes. High above, hidden within the palace balcony shadows, Duke Alexander Ravensshire watched the entire scene unfold in silence. Then, without summoning a single guard, he turned toward the staircase and began walking down into the storm. Rain drummed steadily across the palace courtyard as Duke Alexander Ravensshire descended the broad stone staircase without haste, ignoring the murmurs echoing through the gathered crowd. Nobles leaned beneath embroidered umbrellas, convinced they were about to witness the final humiliation of the strange young woman standing alone before the gates. Servants straightened nervously, expecting the Duke to order her removal before the evening celebrations began. Eliza remained perfectly still, her worn suitcase resting beside her boots, rainwater streaming down her face until tears became impossible to distinguish from the storm. The faded word upon her forehead remained painfully visible beneath strands of soaked dark hair, yet she met the approaching Duke with quiet dignity instead of pleading for mercy. Alexander stopped only an arm's length away. For several silent heartbeats he simply looked at her, not with curiosity or pity, but with careful attention. He noticed the bruises hidden beneath the sleeves of her torn dress, the trembling fingers gripping the old suitcase, and the exhaustion in her eyes that somehow had not extinguished their gentleness. More surprising than anything else, he noticed a tiny soaked sparrow sheltering beneath the edge of the suitcase. While the crowd laughed at her, she had quietly tilted the case to shield the frightened bird from the rain. She had protected something smaller than herself even while no one protected her. Without speaking, Alexander unclasped the heavy royal cloak embroidered with the silver crest of Ravensshire. Gasps swept through the courtyard as he draped it around Eliza's shoulders, covering the ruined gown with rich midnight blue velvet lined in warm fur. The cloak was still warm from his own body. Eliza instinctively tried to return it, believing such a gesture impossible, but Alexander gently raised one gloved hand to stop her. There was no command in the movement, only reassurance. His gaze settled upon the cruel word across her forehead. Carefully removing a white linen handkerchief from his pocket, he dampened it beneath the rain and slowly wiped away as much of the dark ink as the storm had already loosened. The letters refused to disappear completely, but each gentle motion seemed to erase a little of the humiliation attached to them. The courtyard became utterly silent. Finally he asked in a calm voice, "Who chose to mark you this way?" Eliza lowered her eyes for only a moment. "My family." Several nobles exchanged satisfied smiles, expecting her to continue with accusations that would entertain the crowd. Instead she quietly added, "They remain my family. I will not shame them before strangers." Alexander studied her expression carefully. There was no bitterness, only sadness mixed with compassion. Most people wounded so deeply would have seized the opportunity for revenge. She refused it without hesitation. Something inside him quietly settled. The Duke turned toward the palace entrance. "Walk with me, Lady Eliza." Confusion swept across the courtyard. No guard stepped forward. No servant protested. Alexander personally offered his arm. After a brief hesitation, Eliza accepted. Together they crossed the rain-soaked courtyard while hundreds of astonished eyes followed every step. The palace doors opened before them, revealing towering crystal chandeliers whose golden light spilled across polished marble floors. Music faltered as they entered the magnificent ballroom. One violin fell silent, then another until the entire orchestra stopped playing. Every conversation disappeared. Dozens of noble families stared openly. Lord Ashcombe's confident smile vanished the instant he recognized his youngest daughter beneath the Duke's cloak. His elder daughters froze beside him, their jeweled faces draining of color. None of them had expected Alexander to bring her inside himself. Lady Victoria Blackwood, celebrated throughout England for her extraordinary beauty and unmatched ambition, slowly rose from her chair. Draped in shimmering gold silk and sparkling diamonds, she had already imagined herself standing beside the Duke before the evening ended. Seeing Eliza enter beneath his protection shattered those expectations. She stepped forward gracefully, though annoyance sharpened every elegant movement. "Your Grace," she said with polished courtesy, "surely this unfortunate woman has entered by mistake. She has tracked mud across your palace." Alexander answered without raising his voice. "The floors may be cleaned." Victoria forced a brittle smile. "She is clearly unfit for such company." "The company," Alexander replied evenly, "will determine who is unfit." A ripple of uneasy silence passed through the guests. Victoria's expression stiffened. "But she contaminates your celebration." Alexander looked slowly around the room before answering. "No, Lady Victoria." His eyes rested briefly upon the laughing nobles who had mocked Eliza only moments earlier. "Only cruelty contaminates this palace." The words landed with quiet force. No one dared answer. Alexander guided Eliza toward the place of highest honor beside his own seat. Several influential lords exchanged shocked glances. Protocol demanded that such a chair remain empty until the Duke publicly named his chosen bride. Yet he calmly invited the kingdom's most humiliated noblewoman to occupy it. Eliza hesitated. "I should not sit here." "You should sit where you are treated with respect," Alexander answered. Slowly she obeyed. Dinner resumed under strained silence. Servants hurried between tables carrying silver trays filled with roasted pheasant, fresh bread, fragrant vegetables, and autumn fruit. Every noblewoman competed to capture the Duke's attention with practiced laughter, flattering conversation, or carefully rehearsed compliments. Eliza did none of those things. She remained grateful for every kindness shown to her while making no attempt to impress anyone. Halfway through the meal, a frightened servant boy carrying crystal goblets stumbled against another attendant. Several glasses crashed onto the marble floor, shattering into glittering fragments. The child froze in terror, expecting punishment before the assembled nobility. Guests sighed with irritation. Some laughed quietly. One nobleman demanded the boy be dismissed immediately. Before any steward could reach him, Eliza quietly rose from her chair. Ignoring curious stares, she knelt beside the trembling child. "You are bleeding," she whispered after noticing a thin cut across his palm. She removed a clean ribbon from beneath the Duke's cloak and gently wrapped the wound. Then she gathered the broken glass herself, carefully protecting the boy from the sharp edges. "It was an accident," she said softly. "Everyone deserves one chance to recover from fear." The child looked at her with grateful eyes. Alexander watched the entire scene without interruption. He had deliberately instructed senior servants to ignore any mishap during the banquet. It had been another quiet test. Every noble guest had revealed impatience. Only Eliza had responded with compassion. Across the hall, the aging King Edmund observed the exchange from behind his silver goblet. Catching Alexander's eye for only a heartbeat, the monarch gave the slightest approving nod. No words passed between them, yet both understood the meaning. Another piece of the hidden puzzle had fallen into place. As music resumed and dancers filled the polished floor, Lord Ashcombe slipped away from the ballroom with Lady Victoria close behind. They disappeared into a deserted corridor overlooking the moonlit palace gardens, where rain still whispered against stained glass windows. Victoria's pleasant smile vanished completely. "If he continues looking at her," she said coldly, "everything we planned will fail." Lord Ashcombe's jaw tightened. Then she must never become his bride. Neither noticed the hooded figure standing unseen within the shadows beyond the corridor archway, silently listening as every whispered word drifted into the darkness. The morning after the royal harvest ball, the palace awakened beneath low gray clouds and a silence far heavier than the previous night's celebration. Servants whispered through marble corridors, nobles speculated behind closed doors, and every corner of Ravenshire Palace carried the same astonishing rumor. The Duke had ignored the kingdom's celebrated beauties to show extraordinary kindness toward the one-woman society had spent years humiliating. Some called it madness. Others believed grief had clouded Alexander Ravenshire's judgment since losing his wife years earlier. None of them imagined that every word spoken inside the palace was already becoming part of a far greater investigation. Alexander stood alone inside his private library, where towering shelves of leather-bound books surrounded a blazing fireplace. Maps of England covered a large oak table beside coded reports, sealed letters, and sketches of noble family crests connected by crimson threads. It resembled less a nobleman's study than the headquarters of a military campaign. The heavy doors opened quietly, and King Edmund entered wearing a plain dark cloak instead of royal robes. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, but wisdom still shone within his steady eyes. "You have found someone different," the king observed. Alexander looked toward the rain-streaked windows before answering. "I have found someone who still remembers that kindness is stronger than pride." The king nodded slowly. "Then she is already in danger." Those words settled heavily between them. The aging monarch stepped toward the table and unfolded a weathered parchment marked with secret royal seals. "For nearly a year," he said quietly, "our most trusted messengers have disappeared. Treasury records have been altered. Military routes have been copied. Someone among England's highest nobility is preparing to strike during the winter coronation." Alexander studied the map. "We still do not know who leads them." "No," the king replied. "Only that they wear titles, dine at our tables, and smile while plotting the crown's destruction." The duke's expression hardened. "That is why I announced the search for a bride." The king smiled faintly. "Beauty attracts ambition. Power attracts deception. But true character cannot pretend forever." Alexander's gaze drifted toward the palace gardens where Eliza walked slowly among rain-soaked roses, unaware she was being watched. Every noble woman has been tested. And they all desired something. The youngest Ashcombe? Alexander answered without hesitation. She desired nothing except that others suffer less. The king quietly placed one hand upon Alexander's shoulder. "Then trust your judgment. But trust no one else." Meanwhile, Eliza wandered through the palace conservatory, believing the Duke had already forgotten the previous evening's kindness. She admired the autumn flowers blooming beneath tall glass ceilings while helping an elderly gardener lift heavy clay pots onto wooden benches. She never noticed Alexander watching from a distant doorway, silently confirming that her compassion did not appear only when important people observed her. She treated gardeners with the same respect she offered kings. Later that afternoon, Alexander requested a private walk along the palace's western terrace overlooking the river. Eliza accepted nervously. "I fear I have caused trouble for your grace." "You have revealed it," he answered. "There is a difference." She looked at him with quiet confusion. Alexander stopped beside an ancient stone balustrade where ivy climbed weathered columns. "There is something you deserve to know." His voice became lower. "The harvest ball was never truly about choosing the most beautiful bride." Eliza frowned slightly. "I suspected as much." Alexander almost smiled. "The king believes traitors hide among England's greatest noble houses." Her expression changed immediately. "The rumors are true?" "Worse than rumors." He explained carefully that royal documents had vanished, soldiers had disappeared, and secret messages suggested someone planned to seize control of the kingdom during the coming winter coronation. Every family attending the harvest ball had unknowingly been observed for months. Pride, greed, vanity, cruelty, honesty, generosity, every small choice mattered more than wealth or appearance. Eliza listened without interrupting. Finally she asked, "Why tell me?" "Because," Alexander answered honestly, "I believe you may be the only person inside the nobility who has not yet learned to betray others for advantage." Silence stretched between them. Rain drifted softly across the gardens below. "I am not brave enough for conspiracies," Eliza admitted. Alexander shook his head. "Bravery is rarely the absence of fear. It is choosing what is right while afraid." She lowered her eyes. "If innocent people are truly in danger, I will help however I can." For the first time in years, Alexander felt he was no longer carrying the kingdom's burden alone. Unfortunately, hidden behind carved hedges beyond the terrace stood another listener. Lady Victoria Blackwood had followed them unseen. Every important word reached her ears. That evening she secretly met Lord Ashcombe beneath an abandoned chapel near the palace walls. Only a single lantern illuminated the ruined stone chamber where rain leaked through broken ceilings. "He trusts her," Victoria whispered coldly. Lord Ashcombe clenched his fists. Impossible. I heard him myself. If she becomes Duchess, everything ends. Victoria unfolded a folded parchment bearing the royal seal. It does not have to. Lord Ashcombe stared at the document. Where did you get this? There are people inside the palace who prefer gold to loyalty. She smiled without warmth. We shall give the Duke exactly what he fears. Over the next 2 days the conspirators carefully prepared their trap. Ancient royal succession records disappeared from the palace archives. Forged letters accusing Eliza of communicating with foreign enemies were written using copied handwriting. Finally, under cover of darkness, a trusted palace servant bribed by Victoria quietly entered the guest chambers assigned to Eliza. Her old weathered suitcase still rested beside the bed. The servant unlocked it, placed the stolen royal documents inside, added the forged letters, closed it again. No trace remained. The following afternoon the palace erupted into confusion. Royal guards rushed through corridors. Trumpets sounded urgently across the castle grounds. Guests gathered inside the Great Hall as Captain Geoffrey announced that priceless state documents had been stolen. Every room would be searched immediately. Eliza stood calmly beside Alexander while servants inspected luggage throughout the palace. One chest after another revealed nothing. Then the captain reached her suitcase. She watched with puzzled curiosity as the lock opened. His face drained of color. Inside lay ancient royal parchments wrapped beside sealed correspondence bearing her name. The great hall exploded into horrified whispers. Lord Ashcombe stepped backward in carefully performed disbelief. Lady Victoria covered her mouth dramatically. Captain Geoffrey slowly unfolded one letter. Its contents accused Eliza of secretly delivering palace information to unknown conspirators. Alexander stared at the forged handwriting. Impossible. He knew her heart. But before the eyes of England's highest nobility, evidence appeared undeniable. Royal law allowed no exceptions. Captain Geoffrey reluctantly stepped forward holding iron restraints. Lady Eliza Ashcombe, he said painfully, by order of the Crown, you are under arrest for suspected treason. The hall fell silent. Eliza neither cried nor resisted. She simply looked once toward Alexander, searching not for rescue, but for truth within his eyes. He met her gaze steadily. I will find the truth, he said quietly. Before anyone else could speak, cold iron closed around her wrists. Far above the crowded hall, hidden behind the carved wooden gallery where musicians usually performed, a hooded figure watched the arrest unfold with patient satisfaction before disappearing silently into the darkness, certain the kingdom had just condemned its only innocent soul. The prison beneath Ravensshire Palace smelled of cold stone, damp iron, and extinguished hope. Rainwater slipped through narrow cracks high above the cells, falling in slow rhythmic drops that echoed through the darkness. Lady Eliza Ashcombe sat quietly upon a wooden bench, her wrists no longer bound but still marked by the iron restraints that had carried her there. She did not weep for herself. Her greatest fear was that the false accusation against her would weaken the Duke's investigation and allow innocent people to suffer. Every cruel word spoken against her had wounded her heart, yet the thought of England falling into treachery wounded it far more deeply. Above the prison, Duke Alexander Ravensshire refused to surrender to appearances. Every instinct insisted Eliza had been framed. He ordered trusted guards to examine the stolen documents again while he personally questioned servants, archivists, and messengers who had entered the palace during the previous week. Every answer revealed another contradiction. Every contradiction pointed toward careful planning rather than desperate theft. The forged evidence had been created by someone who understood royal procedure intimately. That realization narrowed his list of suspects but provided no proof strong enough to free Eliza before the law. Late that evening an elderly messenger requested a private audience with the Duke. Wrapped in a weather-beaten cloak, the frightened man produced a sealed letter before disappearing almost immediately into the storm. Inside, Alexander found only a single sentence written in hurried ink. She is innocent. Watch the wedding, not the prison. No signature accompanied the warning. The message changed everything. Alexander immediately sought the king. Within the royal council chamber, candlelight flickered across ancient maps and ceremonial swords mounted upon dark oak walls. King Edmund listened without interruption as Alexander explained the anonymous letter and every inconsistency surrounding Eliza's arrest. The conspirators no longer care whether we suspect them, the king said gravely. Their timetable has accelerated. Alexander nodded. They expected us to focus entirely upon proving Eliza's innocence. So while our eyes searched one direction, the king replied, they prepared to strike somewhere else. Neither man needed to ask where. the winter coronation. It would gather every noble family, every royal guard, every influential lord, and every foreign ambassador beneath a single roof. If treason ever had a perfect moment, it was approaching rapidly. To prevent widespread panic, the king publicly announced that the coronation and the duke's wedding would proceed exactly as planned. Officially, Eliza would appear under royal supervision until the investigation concluded. Secretly, additional guards occupied hidden galleries, sealed forgotten tunnels, and replaced several palace servants with loyal soldiers disguised in ordinary uniforms. Alexander hoped the conspirators would believe their deception remained successful long enough to expose themselves completely. On the morning of the ceremony, pale winter sunlight filtered through towering stained-glass windows of St. Aldwyn Cathedral, painting brilliant pools of crimson, sapphire, and gold across polished stone floors. Noble families filled every carved pew wearing magnificent velvet cloaks and glittering jewels. Choir voices rose toward the vaulted ceiling, their solemn harmonies disguising the invisible tension gripping the building. Armed guards blended among musicians, priests, and attendants, their hands never straying far from concealed weapons. Eliza entered wearing a simple ivory gown rather than elaborate royal finery. Though accused before the kingdom, she carried herself with quiet grace untouched by bitterness. Soft scars remained upon her wrists, but dignity shone more brightly than any diamond surrounding her. When Alexander saw her walking toward the altar, he realized that hardship had not diminished her spirit. It had revealed its extraordinary strength. The ceremony had scarcely begun when disaster erupted. A thunderous crash echoed through the cathedral as smoke bombs exploded near the western entrance. Thick gray clouds swallowed the colored sunlight. Guests screamed. Horses outside reared wildly. Hidden doors burst open, releasing masked assassins armed with swords and crossbows. Their attack unfolded with terrifying precision. "Protect the king," Alexander shouted. Steel rang against steel as royal guards rushed forward. The duke drew his sword and met the first attacker before the man reached the royal platform. Sparks flew each time their blades collided beneath towering columns. Another assassin lunged toward King Edmund, only to be intercepted by palace soldiers emerging from concealed passages. Throughout the cathedral, chaos spread like wildfire, separating families and overturning benches while frightened voices echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Eliza remained near the altar, searching desperately through the swirling smoke instead of fleeing. Her eyes followed every movement across the shattered sanctuary until something caught her attention high above the choir loft. Hidden behind a carved stone pillar, almost invisible through drifting smoke, a masked crossbowman slowly took aim. Not at the king. At Alexander. The duke never saw him. His attention remained fixed upon the swordsman pressing relentlessly against him. There was no time to shout. No time to think. Eliza ran. Ignoring terrified cries around her, she threw herself across the final stretch of marble between the crossbow and the man she loved. The bowstring snapped. The bolt struck her shoulder with brutal force. She staggered once before collapsing directly into Alexander's arms. Time seemed to stop. The duke caught her before she reached the floor, horror replacing every trace of battlefield composure. Blood stained the white silk of her gown as she struggled to remain conscious. "You chose me," she whispered weakly. "I always would." Alexander held her close while rage unlike anything he had ever known swept through him. Rising carefully, he entrusted Eliza to the palace physician before charging toward the fleeing crossbowman with relentless determination. The assassin escaped through a concealed doorway leading into forgotten passages beneath the cathedral. Alexander pursued without hesitation, accompanied by Captain Geoffrey and several loyal guards. Torches illuminated twisting tunnels lined with centuries-old stonework where fleeing footsteps echoed ahead. The chase climbed narrow staircases, crossed hidden bridges above underground chambers, and finally emerged onto the rain-soaked rooftops connecting the cathedral to the royal palace. Wind howled across slippery slate tiles as cloaked figures scattered in different directions. Captain Geoffrey captured one conspirator near the bell tower, while another fell after attempting to leap between rooftops. The masked crossbowman reached the palace's highest terrace before Alexander finally cornered him against the crumbling edge. Rather than surrender, the man laughed. "You are already too late," he declared. Before Alexander could question him further, another voice interrupted from the staircase below. An elderly palace nurse stepped into the rain clutching a weathered leather chest against her trembling breast. "I cannot remain silent any longer," she cried. Inside the chest rested carefully preserved birth records, baptism certificates, and a tiny silver bracelet engraved with an unfamiliar noble crest. Looking directly at the wounded Eliza being carried across the courtyard below, the old nurse raised tear-filled eyes toward the stunned king. "My sovereign," she whispered, "Lady Eliza Ashcombe was never an Ashcombe at all. She is the stolen daughter of the late Duke of Ashford, taken as an infant so her inheritance could be stolen, and the truth has waited 22 years for this night." Morning broke gently over Ravensshire Palace, washing away the violence of the previous night with pale golden light that shimmered across rain-soaked stone. Bells rang slowly from every church tower in the capital, not in celebration, but in remembrance of those who had defended the kingdom against betrayal. Within the royal infirmary, Lady Eliza rested peacefully while the palace physician carefully changed the bandages covering her wounded shoulder. The crossbow bolt had missed her heart by little more than an inch. She had survived because courage had carried her where fear never could. When her eyes finally opened, the first face she saw was Duke Alexander Ravensshire seated beside her bed. He had not left the room since the attack ended. His usually composed features showed exhaustion, relief, and quiet gratitude all at once. "You should have saved yourself," he whispered. Eliza managed a faint smile. "If I had, England would have lost the man who protects her." Alexander gently took her hand, his voice breaking for the first time since they had met. "No title I possess could ever equal what you gave me yesterday." Before she could answer, King Edmund entered accompanied by Captain Geoffrey, the elderly nurse, and several members of the royal council. The atmosphere carried neither ceremony nor judgment. Instead it carried truth. The weathered chest containing the hidden records rested upon a velvet cushion before the king. One by one the ancient documents were examined before witnesses. The baptism register matched the bracelet recovered from the chest. Birth records bore the unmistakable seal of Ashford. Testimony from surviving servants confirmed that an infant daughter had disappeared during the funeral of the late Duke of Ashford 22 years earlier. Lord Ashcombe had secretly claimed the child as his own after arranging the kidnapping, allowing him to seize the vast Ashford inheritance through deception while ensuring no rightful heir remained to challenge his fortune. Silence filled the chamber after the final document had been read. King Edmund approached Eliza's bedside and bowed his head with unmistakable respect. "My lady," he said softly, "your birthright was stolen before you learned your first word. Yet despite growing amid cruelty, you became exactly the woman your true parents would have prayed you to become." Tears gathered quietly in Eliza's eyes. "I never wanted wealth." "I know," the king replied. "That is precisely why heaven trusted you with it." Within hours the entire conspiracy unraveled. The captured assassins confessed under lawful questioning. Hidden correspondence recovered from secret tunnels exposed every noble involved in the plot. Lady Victoria Blackwood had financed the theft of royal records while Lord Ashcombe coordinated payments, forged documents, and false witnesses. Several influential lords who had smiled politely inside the palace for years were revealed as willing participants in the conspiracy against the crown. Royal guards arrested them before sunset. None escaped justice. The kingdom watched in stunned disbelief as families once admired for privilege lost every title through greed. Lord Ashcombe was brought before the king in chains. His proud posture had disappeared. For the first time he looked smaller than the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. "You owe Lady Eliza more than an apology," King Edmund declared. Lord Ashcombe lowered his eyes. "I have none worthy enough." Eliza stepped forward despite the pain in her healing shoulder. The entire court expected anger. Perhaps even vengeance. Instead she spoke quietly. "I forgive you." The words stunned every listener. Lord Ashcombe looked up in confusion. "You forgive me? I cannot carry hatred into the future I have been given." She paused before continuing. "But forgiveness does not erase justice." The king nodded solemnly. "Nor should it." Lord Ashcombe and every surviving conspirator were stripped of rank, lands, and influence before being led away to face lawful punishment. Justice had spoken without surrendering compassion. Several weeks later, after peace had returned across England, preparations began for a wedding unlike any the kingdom expected. Advisors suggested a magnificent cathedral ceremony attended by foreign monarchs, elaborate processions, and priceless displays of wealth. Alexander refused every proposal. "There is only one place worthy of becoming our beginning," he said. On a cool spring afternoon, thousands gathered within the palace courtyard where relentless rain had once soaked a lonely young woman dressed in torn clothing. The broken paving stones had been restored. Fresh flowers lined every walkway. Children from villages across the duchy stood beside noble families without distinction, while servants occupied places of honor instead of remaining hidden behind doors. No guest was separated by birth or title. Alexander insisted that everyone who had witnessed Eliza's humiliation should now witness her triumph. Soft clouds drifted overhead. A gentle rain began falling just before the ceremony. Many smiled at the coincidence. Alexander simply whispered, "The heavens remember." Eliza entered wearing an elegant ivory gown embroidered with delicate silver leaves inspired by the Ashford crest. No jewels glittered upon her forehead. The cruel mark that had once branded her identity had faded almost completely, though a faint shadow remained beneath her skin. She made no effort to hide it. When she reached the center of the courtyard, King Edmund stepped forward carrying a folded white silk cloth. He looked toward the assembled kingdom. "Years ago," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, "this place witnessed laughter born from cruelty." He turned toward Eliza. "They called kindness unwanted." With extraordinary gentleness, the king lifted the silk and touched the faint remaining trace upon her forehead. "The mark placed there by hatred ends today." He slowly wiped away the final visible shadow until nothing remained. Then he faced the crowd. "A kingdom that brands compassion as unwanted prepares its own destruction. Let this day be remembered differently. Today England chooses mercy over pride, character over beauty, and courage over birth." Thunderous applause swept through the courtyard. Many who had once mocked Eliza lowered their heads in shame. Alexander stepped toward her. His eyes never left hers. "The first moment I saw you," he said softly, "everyone else noticed torn clothing, rain, and humiliation." He gently took both her hands. "I noticed a woman shielding a frightened bird while no one shielded her." Emotion filled Eliza's smile. "You saw me. I saw the Duchess my heart had already chosen." The vows that followed contained no grand promises of power or riches. Instead, they promised honesty during hardship, gentleness during disagreement, faith during uncertainty, and unwavering loyalty until life's final day. When Alexander placed the wedding ring upon Eliza's finger, the palace bells erupted across the capital. Children cheered. Flowers filled the air. For the first time in many years, England celebrated not merely a royal marriage, but the triumph of goodness over ambition. Months passed peacefully. Rather than expanding her wealth, Eliza transformed the restored Ashford estate into a sanctuary called the House of Second Chances. Orphan children filled its gardens with laughter. Young women rejected by their families found education, safety, and meaningful work. Elderly widows shared stories beside warm fireplaces instead of facing lonely winters alone. Every room reflected the compassion Eliza herself had once desperately needed. Alexander often escaped palace duties early simply to spend evenings there. He read adventure stories to children before bed, repaired broken toys alongside village carpenters, and planted fruit trees throughout the grounds so no child would ever know hunger. Visitors soon discovered something remarkable. The Duke and Duchess ruled England with wisdom because they first learned how to love ordinary people. Years later, one bright spring afternoon, their young son raced laughing through blooming gardens chasing butterflies with several adopted children who had become brothers and sisters by choice rather than blood. He eventually stopped beneath an ancient oak tree where Alexander and Eliza watched the children together. "Father," the little boy asked innocently, "why does everyone smile whenever mother walks past?" Alexander knelt beside him. He glanced toward Eliza, who was helping a frightened little girl plant her very first rosebush. Sunlight surrounded her like quiet blessing. Then he answered with a tenderness earned through every trial they had endured. "Because long before you were born, many people believed greatness belonged only to the beautiful, the powerful, or the fortunate. Your mother taught an entire kingdom that greatness belongs to those who remain kind when the world gives them every reason not to be." The child looked thoughtfully toward his mother before running to help the little girl finish planting the rose. Alexander slipped his hand into Eliza's as laughter echoed through the flourishing gardens built upon justice, forgiveness, and hope. Together they watched children once abandoned discover families, servants dine beside nobles without fear, and a kingdom forever changed by the woman they had once called unwanted. From that day forward, no child entering the House of Second Chances was ever asked where they had come from. They were asked only one question: "Are you home now?" And every smiling answer became the living proof that kindness, more than blood, beauty, or birthright, had created the greatest Duchess England would ever know.